In this video, we're going to complete the KutaSoftware Infinite Pre-Calculus free worksheet, Average Rates of Change. Now, a rate of change isn't something new. If you think back to pre-algebra or Algebra 1, when we found the slope of the line, we were finding the average rate of change of that line. However, that average rate of change was constant because it was a straight line. Here, we're going to be dealing with parabolas and other functions where the rate of change is not constant. That's why we're going to find the average. So for each problem, find the average rate of change of the function over the given interval. There's a formula for the average rate of change. That's a of x, and that's going to be equivalent to the function at x minus the function at a, and then we're going to take x minus a. So the change in y values essentially over the change in x values. So f of x and f of a are the respective function values for points a and x. So in number 1, it gives us -2 and -7/4. So let's find where those are at. -2 falls approximately here, and -7/4 is -1 and 1/4, which falls approximately here. So we're finding f of x minus f of a, so the change in y, over the change in x. So essentially, we're finding the slope of a line formed by these 2 points. And a line formed by these 2 points, it's a little hard to see in this diagram, but that line intersects the function at 2 different points. So it's a secant line. So we're finding the slope of a secant line of the function. And now we'll go about plugging in those numbers for the average rate of change formula. However, I like to solve for f of x and f of a separately. So f of x is going to be equal to -2, and a is going to be equal to -7/4. So f of x is going to be f of -2, and that's going to be -2 squared plus -2 minus 1, plugging in -2 for x in f of x. -2 squared is going to be a +4, and then we're going to be adding -2 and then subtracting 1. 4 plus -2 is going to be +2, and taking away 1, that will be a +1. So f of -2 equals +1. Now let's find f of a. F of a is going to be f of -7/4. So we'll have -7/4 squared plus -7/4 minus 1. And when we square -7/4, we will get 49, and that's going to be a +49 over 16 because we're squaring the numerator and the denominator. So that's going to be 49 over 16, and we're adding that to -7/4. As opposed to adding -7/4, we'll multiply both the top and bottom by 4 so that we have a denominator of 16. So we're going to be adding that to -28 over 16. And again, what I did here, I just made my fraction have a common denominator. So when we squared that first fraction, our new denominator was 16. So I multiplied both the numerator and denominator by 4 so that I get a denominator of 16. Now I can add those. And then we're going to subtract 1, which I'll write 1 as 16 over 16. So now we have a common denominator between all of our fractions. So if we have 49 and we take away 28, we will get 21. So 21 over 16, and then we're going to subtract 16 over 16. That will give us that our function at -7/4 is going to be equivalent to 21 minus 16 over 16, which is 5/16. Now looking back at our average rate of change formula, we have a of x, and that's the average rate of change of the change in interval. So we'll have f of x, which f of -2 was a +1, and we're going to be subtracting f of -7/4 which was f of a, so subtracting a positive 5/16, and that's all over x minus a, so negative 2 minus negative 7/4. So now we're going to simplify. 1 minus 5/16 we can think of as 16/16 minus 5/16, having a common denominator in our numerator, and then negative 2 minus a negative 7/4. I'll write this as negative 8/4 plus a positive 7/4. So simplifying, 16 minus 5 is going to be 11, so we'll have 11/16 all over negative 8 plus a positive 7 is negative 1, so that's negative 1/4. And remember, when we're dividing by a fraction, we can multiply by that reciprocal, so we'll have 11/16 times negative 4 over 1, so that will be 11 times negative 4, which is negative 44, all over 16 times 1, which is 16, and simplifying, we can divide both by 4, so dividing the numerator by 4, we'll get negative 11 over, dividing the denominator by 4, 4. So our average rate of change for number 1 is negative 11/4. That is the slope of the secant line. And the secant line was a line connected using x, f of x, and a, f of a, as the points on that line. Let's move on to number 2. In number 2, we're finding the average rate of change of the function f of x of 1 over x minus 3, where our x value will be negative 2, and our a value is going to be negative 3/2. So plotting negative 2, and then we're going to be looking for negative 3/2, which is negative 1.5. Those are the 2 points that will help us form our secant line, which we're finding the slope of. So again, to start, I'm going to find f of x, then I'll find f of a, and finally plug that into my formula to solve. So f of x is going to be f of negative 2. So plugging negative 2 in, I'll have 1 over negative 2 minus 3, which is equivalent to 1 over negative 2 minus 3 is negative 5. So we'll have negative 1/5 for f of negative 2. Now I'll find f of negative 3/2. So that's going to be 1 over x, which is negative 3/2, minus 3. So f of a is equal to f of negative 3/2, and when simplifying, I'll write this as 1 over negative 3/2 minus 6/2, writing that over the same denominator, and that'll get me 1 over negative 3 minus 6 is going to be negative 9, so it's negative 9/2. And when you're dividing by a fraction, you're just going to multiply by that reciprocal. So we're going to flip that fraction and multiply. So we'll have 1 times negative 2 over 9, so we'll have negative 2/9 as f of negative 3/2. So now that we know f of x and f of a, we'll plug that into our formula. F of x, f of negative 2 is equal to negative 1/5, and then f of a, f of negative 3/2 is equal to negative 2/9. So minus negative 2/9, that's going to be all over x minus a, which is negative 2 minus negative 3/2. Now we'll simplify and solve. Finding a common denominator between 5 and 9, we'll use 45. So multiplying the first fraction by 9 over 9, I'll get negative 9 over 45, and I'll be subtracting a negative 2/9, but as opposed to subtracting a negative, I'll add a positive, and we're going to be multiplying 2/9 by 5 over 5. So that'll be 10 over 45. So negative 9/45 plus 10/45 for our numerator, and that's all over negative 2 minus negative 3/2, which, writing those numbers with a common denominator, we'll have negative 4 halves plus 3 halves, because subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive. So that's going to give me negative 9 plus 10 will be a positive 1. So 1/45 all over negative 4 plus 3 is going to be negative 1, and that's over 2. So we have 1/45 divided by negative 1/2. So we'll rewrite that as 1/45 times a negative 2 over 1, which will be equal to negative 2 over 45. So negative 2/45 is the average rate of change for number 2. And remember, the average rate of change is the slope of that secant line. And our secant line is formed by plotting our 2 given points. Let's move on to number 3. Now 3 through 8 are exactly like numbers 1 and 2, except that we're not given a graph. But we're still going to be using that same formula for the average rate of change. So for number 3, our x value is equal to 3, and our a value will be 13/4. So we're going to find f of x. So f of x will be equal to f of 3. So we'll take 3 and plug that in for x in our equation. So that will be 3 squared minus 3 minus 1, which will equal 9 minus 3 minus 1, which is 9, minus 3 is 6, minus 1 will be a positive 5. So f of 3 is a positive 5. Now let's look at f of a. F of a is going to be equal to f of 13/4. So we're going to plug 13/4 in for x in that equation. So f of 13/4 is equal to 13/4 squared minus 13/4 minus 1. Now 13/4 squared, we're going to square 13 and 4, squaring the numerator and the denominator. So 13 squared is 169, so that'll be 169 over 16, because 4 squared is 16. And then I'm going to write these last 2 terms so that we have a common denominator. So that will be multiplying 13/4 by 4 over 4, which will be 52 over 16, and then multiplying 1 by 16 over 16. So now you can see I have 16 as my common denominator, and when I take 169, I subtract 52, and then I subtract 16, I'll get 101. So I'll have 101 over 16. That is f of a for number 3. Now remembering our formula, f of x minus f of a all over x minus a. I'm going to have f of x, which is 5, minus f of a, which is 101 over 16, and that's going to be divided by x, which is 3, minus 13/4. Now I'm going to find a common denominator in my numerator, so I'm just going to multiply 5 by 16 over 16. 16 times 5 is 80, so that's going to be 80 over 16 minus 101 over 16, which for my numerator, 80 minus 101 is a negative 21. So that will be negative 21/16 as my numerator. And then in my denominator, I'm going to multiply my 3 by 4 over 4. So I'll get 12/4 minus 13/4, which 12 minus 13 is a negative 1. So that will be negative 1/4. Dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by that flipped fraction, or that reciprocal. So I'm going to have negative 21 over 16 times negative 4 over 1, which 21 times 4 is 84, and a negative times negative is a positive. So we'll have 84 over 16. However, this fraction can be simplified. Both are divisible by 4. 84 divided by 4 is 21, and 16 divided by 4 is 4. So 21/4 is my solution for the average rate of change of the function in number 3. Now let's continue on to number 4. In number 4, we're given the function of x equals negative x squared minus x plus 1. So we'll have x equal to 2, and we'll have 7/3 equal to a. So finding f of x, we'll be finding f of 2, and f of 2 is going to be equal to negative 2 squared minus 2 plus 1. So the opposite of 2 squared is 4, so that's going to be negative 4 minus 2 plus 1, which is a negative 5. And for f of a, we're solving for f of 7/3. So the function at 7/3 is going to be negative 7/3 squared minus 7/3 plus 1. So it'll be the opposite of 7/3 squared, which 7 squared is 49, and 3 squared is 9. And then we'll be subtracting 7/3, but I want a common denominator of 9, so I'll multiply by 3 over 3, so that's 21 over 9, and then I'll be adding 9 over 9, which is equivalent to 1. Now simplifying, negative 49 minus 21 plus 9 is equal to negative 61, so we'll have negative 61 over 9. That is f of 7/3. So for our average rate of change formula, remember that's f of x minus f of a all over x minus a. F of x is negative 5 minus f of a, which is negative 61/9, and that's all over x of 2 minus a of 7/3. So in order to simplify the numerator, I have to find that common denominator of 9, so I'm going to multiply negative 5 by 9 over 9. So that will be negative 45 over 9 minus a negative, so adding the positive, 61 over 9, and that's all over 2 minus 7/3, which I'll write as 6/3 minus 7/3, since 6/3 is equivalent to 2, and that will give me negative 45 plus 61 is a positive 16, so 16/9 divided by 6/3 minus 7/3 is negative 1/3. Now I'll just multiply by the reciprocal of that denominator. So 16/9 times negative 3 over 1 equals negative 48/9. However, each of my terms are divisible by 3, so dividing the numerator by 3, I'll get 16, and dividing the denominator by 3, I'll get 3. So negative 16/3 is my average rate of change in number 4. Let's continue on to number 5. For number 5, our x is equal to 1, and our a will be equal to 3/2. So f of x, I'll use f of 1, so plugging 1 in for x, we will get 2 times 1 squared minus 2 times 1 minus 1, which 2 times 1 squared is 2, minus 2 times 1 will be minus 2, and then we're subtracting 1. So 2 minus 2 is 0, minus 1 is negative 1. So f of 1 equals negative 1. Now let's find f of a, which is f of 3/2. So I'm going to plug 3/2 in, so I'll have 2 times 3/2 squared minus 2 times 3/2, and then minus 1. 2 times 3/2 squared is 2 times 9/4, because 3 squared is 9, and 2 squared is 4, and I'll be subtracting 2 times 3/2, which 2 will cancel out with 2 in the denominator, so that will be minus 3, and then we're subtracting 1. 2 times 9/4, that 2 will cancel out with 2 in the denominator, so I'll have 9/2, or I can simply multiply that out to get 18/4, which simplifies down to 9/2. I'm going to be subtracting 3, so I'm going to write that in terms of 2 in the denominator. So multiplying by 2 over 2, I'll subtract 6/2, which again, 6 divided by 2 is 3, and then I'll subtract 2/2 because 2 divided by 2 is 1. So 9 minus 6 is 3, and then I'll be subtracting 2 to get a positive 1. So 1/2 is f of 3/2. So for my formula, f of x minus f of a all over x minus a, essentially finding the slope of that secant line. F of x is -1, and I'm going to be subtracting f of a, which is 1/2, and that's all over x of 1 minus a of 3/2. So I'll have -1, which I'll write as -2 over 2, minus 1/2, all over 1 minus 3/2, which I'll write as 2/2 minus 3/2, so that I can add or subtract those fractions. -2 minus 1 is -3, so I'll have -3/2 in the numerator, and that's going to be divided by 2 minus 3, which is -1, so -1/2 in the denominator. -3/2 divided by -1/2 is the same as -3/2 times -2 over 1, which -3 times -2 is a positive 6, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. Or we could simply cancel out the 2 in both the numerator and denominator to get -3 over -1, which is a positive 3. So 3 is my solution in number 5. So 3 is the average rate of change from x equaling 1 to the point where x is 3/2. For number 6, my x will be -4 and my a will be -11/3. So I'm going to find f of x and f of a. So f of x is going to be f of -4, which when I plug -4 in, I'll get 1 over -4 minus 1, which is equal to 1 over -5, or -1/5. Now I'll find f of a, and f of a will be the function at -11/3. So plugging -11/3 in, I'll get 1 over -11/3 minus 1, which I will write as 1 over -11/3 minus, I'll rewrite 1 as 3/3. So I'll have 1 all over -11 minus 3 is -14, so that'll be -14/3. And when you're dividing by a fraction, that's the same as multiplying by that reciprocal. So we'll have 1 times -3/14, which is equal to -3/14. So f of a is -3/14. Now I'll plug that into my average rate of change formula, f of x minus f of a over x minus a. So f of x is -1/5, and we'll be subtracting f of a, which is -3/14, and that's all divided by x minus a, which is -4 minus -11/3. Now my common denominator within my numerator, 5 and 14, will be 70. So multiply my first fraction by 14 over 14, I'll get -14 over 70, and then subtracting -3/14, I'll be adding a positive, and I'll be multiplying that by 5 over 5, which will be 15 over 70. So you can see that for my numerator, -14 plus 15 is +1, so that's 1 over 70 in my numerator, and in my denominator, -4 minus -11/3, I'll rewrite -4 as -12/3, and then as opposed to subtracting a negative, I'll add a positive 11/3. So -12/3 plus 11/3 is a -1/3. So I'll have 1/70th over -1/3, which will be 1/70th times -3 over 1, which equals -3 over 70. So -3/70ths, or -3 over 70, is my solution for the average rate of change in number 6, -3 over 70. Let's move on to number 7. In number 7, we have the function of x equal to 1 over x plus 3. So we'll say that x, the first value of our x point is negative 1, and a, the second value, will be negative 2/3. So f of x will be f of negative 1, which equals 1 over negative 1 plus 3, which equals 1/2, or 1 over 2. And f of a equals f of negative 2/3, which is equal to 1 over negative 2/3 plus 3. So that's going to be 1 over negative 2/3 plus 3, I'll write as 9/3, since 9 divided by 3 is 3, which will give us 1 over negative 2 plus 9 is going to be a positive 7. So 1 over 7/3, which is equal to 1 times 3 over 7, or 3/7. So 1/2 is f of x, and 3/7 is f of a. Now I'll plug that into my average rate of change formula. F of x minus f of a all over x minus a. So that's 1/2 minus 3/7 all over negative 1 minus a negative 2/3. Simplifying the numerator, finding that common denominator, we'll use 14. So 1/2 is equivalent to 7/14, and we'll subtract 3/7, which is equivalent to 6/14. And for our denominator, negative 1 minus a negative 2/3, writing negative 1 with a denominator of 3, we'll have negative 3/3, and as opposed to subtracting negative 2/3, we'll add 2/3. So now in our numerator, 7 minus 6 is 1, so we'll have 1/14. And in our denominator, negative 3 plus 2 will be negative 1, so that will be negative 1/3. So 1/14 divided by negative 1/3 is the same as 1/14 times negative 3 over 1, which is equivalent to negative 3 over 14. So negative 3/14 is the average rate of change in number 7. Now for number 8, our x will be negative 4, and our a value will be negative 7/2. So f of x will be f of negative 4. So that will be negative, or the opposite, of 1 over, plugging negative 4 in for x, negative 4 minus 1, which is negative 1 over negative 4 minus 1 is negative 5. So negative 1 over negative 5 is going to be a positive 1/5. Now for f of a, that's going to be f of negative 7/2. So plugging negative 7/2 in for x in our function. So that's going to be the opposite, or negative 1 over negative 7/2 minus 1, which we'll write as negative 1 over negative 7/2 minus 1, written in terms of halves. So that will be negative 7/2 minus 2/2. So negative 1 over negative 7 minus 2 is negative 9. So negative 1 over negative 9/2. And as opposed to dividing 1 by negative 9/2, we'll multiply by negative 2 over 9. So negative 1 times negative 2 over 9 will equal positive 2 over 9, or positive 2/9. So f of x minus f of a will be 1/5 minus 2/9, and that's going to be all over x minus a, which is negative 4, minus negative 7/2. So again, writing the formula one more time, that's f of x minus f of a all over x minus a. So for our numerator, as opposed to having 1/5 minus 2/9, writing that in terms of a common denominator, I'll multiply my first fraction by 9 over 9. So I'll have 9 over 45 minus my second fraction, I'll multiply by 5 over 5, so minus 10 over 45. And then in my denominator, I'll write negative 4 in terms of halves. So I'll have negative 8/2, because negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. And as opposed to subtracting a negative 7/2, I'll add a positive 7/2, since that's the same. So 9 minus 10 is going to be negative 1/45, and that's all over -8 plus 7, which is -1 half. So now I'll multiply the numerator by the reciprocal of the denominator. So -1 45th times -2 over 1 will equal +2 over 45, or +2 45ths for number 8. Let's move on to the last problem of our average rates of change worksheet, number 9. On to number 9. It says that the police have accused the driver of breaking the speed limit of 60 miles per hour. As proof, they provide 2 photographs. One photo shows the driver's car passing a toll booth at exactly 6 p.m. The second photo shows the driver's car passing another toll booth, which was down the highway, at exactly 6:30 p.m. Does the photo evidence prove that the driver broke the speed limit during this time? So they're saying that he broke the speed limit of 60 miles per hour. So we're going to find the average rate of change, miles over hour, and see if that is indeed greater than 60. So the change in miles from the first photo booth to the second photo booth is given to us as 31. So we have 31 miles in our numerator, and in our denominator is going to be the change in time. So between 6:30 p.m. and 6 p.m., that is a difference of 30 minutes. So delta t, which I'll just write as the change in time, is equal to 30 minutes. However, we don't want this in terms of minutes, we want it in terms of hours, and 30 minutes is equal to 1/2 of an hour. So 31 miles over the course of half an hour, so divided by half an hour is the average rate of change within that time period. So we'll have 31 miles divided by 1/2 hours, which 31 divided by 1/2 we can write as 31 times 2 over 1, which will be 62 miles per hour. And 62 miles per hour is greater than 60 miles per hour. Therefore, the photo evidence does indeed prove that the driver broke the speed limit during that time because his average rate of change was 62. So sometimes he could have been going faster than 62, and sometimes he could have been going slower, but that average rate of change was 62, which is greater than the speed limit of 60. So at some point, he had to definitely be going over 60 miles per hour. Whether that was traveling at a constant speed of 62 miles per hour or sometimes going 70 for a certain amount of time and then dropping down to the speed limit, averaging out to be 62, it doesn't matter. The average rate of change was 62, therefore he did indeed go over the speed limit. So yes, the average rate of change is 62 miles per hour, so the driver must have been breaking the speed limit at some time, whether that was the entire time or the smallest portion of time. The average rate of change is 62, so at some time that driver was breaking the speed limit. And with that, we wrap up this worksheet. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. All likes and subscriptions are greatly appreciated.